to bring us to a topic, Alan, that is certainly I don't think it should be controversial, but I feel like it's become controversial recently, and that's this idea of balance. And so the reason I bring it up is our last guest was Steve Magnus, and
I
he
love.
recently put it. Steve's fantastic. I mean, if you're listening, you haven't checked out his work, highly recommend. We'll
Totally.
drop his Twitter link in the description, and his books, just fantastic. But he has a new book called "Win the Inside Game." It's all about mental performance and mindset. And one of the ideas that he talks about is balance, and this idea that especially in American culture, there's the idea of grinding and just going after your goals, bar none, and ignoring everything else, and just putting your head down and working. And certainly, if you log on to Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it now, and if you go through some of the advice that you see on there, that is very much the advice. It's this, you are not an entrepreneur unless you're working 100 hours a week. You're not an entrepreneur, unless you have to ignore your family, your friends, and everything, just devote yourself to your work, right? A lot of people call it hustle porn. It's this idea that all you have to do is hustle. Anyhow, Steve talks about the idea of balance, and he says, well, if you want to do this for a long time, you do have to have some sort of balance. And we were laughing about, and as a basketball fan, you'd probably appreciate this, about the example of Nikola Jokic, right, who was arguably the best basketball player in the NBA, multiple-time MVP. But he goes home to Serbia over the summer and races horses, and seemingly, at least from what we can tell, doesn't touch a basketball for 3 months, and then comes back and is dominating the NBA. And Steve talks about how, maybe we should learn something from that, and maybe it's good to take some time off and to re-energize and all that. So all of that to say, your idea, kind of your thoughts on those ideas, and what your relationship with balance is.
I'm so fascinated by the English language, and I'm so fascinated by vernacular and different word choices. And every single word in the English language, which is the only language I speak, has an emotional connotation. As in, you say the word, and the word itself brings up some feelings and some emotions. And many times, the same word can bring up different emotions amongst different people. So you and I may hear the same word, but we feel differently about it. And the reason I say that is, so the word balance has never worked well for me personally because it connotates to me, I picture a triple beam scale, and it connotates that everything needs to be equal. And in my mind, the way I interpret that, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but I've always interpreted that as, well, if I'm going to work 40 hours a week, and I say my kids are important, then I should also be with my kids 40 hours a week. And that was always a struggle for me. So for me, I think I understand the sentiment at which you and Steve are discussing, but I'm always looking for what I would call work-life harmony, or work-life flow, or work-life integration, which is basically saying, I want to make sure that I'm not just succeeding and tipping the scales in one area of my life, but I'm able to do that across the board to whatever it is that I deem important, and that I am able to unplug and untether and get away from certain things when I need a break, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or what have you. So yes, I'm a huge advocate of that. I do believe we only have so much bandwidth anyway, which is why I said I've chosen to limit my focus and attention and heart and soul into just those four pillars. If I started to add a fifth, sixth, and seventh, I'd be afraid I'd spread myself too thin. And so for me, that's what works best. And it will ebb and flow. To me, instead of trying to make sure that I'm always balanced among the time that I'm spending on each of those things, I recognize that those four things for me are going to constantly be in flux, and they're going to constantly ebb and flow. There are some months where my speaking calendar is more full and I'm traveling more and I'm busier, and I'm not able to see my kids or my friends or family as much those months. And then there's other months where the speaking calendar is much lighter and I'm not traveling, and I can double down and spend a lot more time with friends and family and my kids. There's some times where my schedule's so busy that I have to curtail the amount of time I spend on my self-care. Then there's other times where the schedule's wide open and I have more time to devote. So what I try and do is wherever I am, I try to be there. I try to be all in, be fully present, be fully engaged, and give whatever that thing or that person is my full attention and everything I've got. Because I found for me, the struggle with balance would be if I'm traveling a lot, but then I'm starting to feel guilty that I'm not seeing my kids. So while I'm traveling, I'm thinking about my kids and I'm feeling guilty and shameful. And then I'm not really doing anything at an elite level. So instead, and now that my kids are older, and for context for your listeners and viewers, I have twin sons that just turned 15. So they're freshmen in high school. And I have a daughter that will be 13 this summer. She's in 7th grade. So, they're teenage years. Obviously, this is still a very impressionable and crucial time for their father to be in their lives, to love them, to mentor them, to support them, So I very much believe in being a very present father, but I've also realized that the lifestyle and the vocation that I've chosen means there's going to be times when I'm away. There's going to be times where I'm in Orlando at a speaking engagement and I'm going to miss my son's JV basketball game. But that is a trade that I'm willing to make at present. It's a trade that I've had a conversation with my children about. So this is not something like I'm just deciding and just saying, yeah, this is what I do, deal with it. I've let them know that as their father, one of my biggest hopes for them is that they end up growing up to find something that they're just as passionate about as I am about my career and my speaking, and that it fills my bucket, and that I feel like I'm making a contribution and I'm adding value to people's lives, and I love what I do. And because I love what I do, and because what I love to do is kind of a non-conventional vocation, there has to be some sacrifices involved, which means I'm going to miss some things. And my kids understand that, and we've had that discussion, and it works for us. At the same time, my kids know that when I'm not at a speaking engagement and I'm actually home in the state of Maryland, they are my number one focus and they take priority over everything else. So the reason you and I can schedule this podcast right now is because my kids are in school at the moment and there's nothing I can be doing with them. So this works out perfectly for us. If you had asked me to schedule this at a time where they had a basketball game or it was a night where I'm supposed to take them to dinner, then I would have politely declined, or we would have had to find another time to schedule. So again, I'm not saying that what works for me is going to work for anybody else, but it does work really well at present. And that's kind of how I view balance. Another word that you brought up that has a very different connotation for people is the word grind. I don't use the word grind to describe anything in my life. I don't grind 24/7. In fact, in full transparency, and this might even sound comical, you know what I was doing right before we jumped on this call? I took a 30-minute nap. I actually took a nap because I played basketball at 6 a.m. this morning. I knocked out a bunch of work and did some calls earlier, and I had a little bit of downtime, and I need to recharge my body because my goal is to be able to stay up late enough tonight to watch the Sweet 16 games. And when they have a 10 o'clock start time, that's pretty much past my bedtime. So I literally took a nap before doing this. And I do it with a huge smile. Like there's no guilt involved. That's part of my self-care routine. And I don't feel the need to work 16-hour days. Now, there have been times in my career where I have logged some serious hours. And if you look over the breadth of my career, like I've paid my dues and I've put in my hours. So I believe in hard work. And I believe that if you want to be good at anything, you've got to be willing to put in some hard work and put in some hours. But I also don't think that it needs to monopolize everything that you do. And I don't think you need to do it just as a badge of honor. There are days where I work more than others, but there are days where I'll take the entire day off and do absolutely nothing work related. And it's incredibly refreshing and it's invigorating. And then similar to Jokic, which you just mentioned, then I come back even hungrier and more excited to get back to it because I took some time off. And my guess is because he is so committed to the game of basketball for the 9 or 10 months that he's playing for the Nuggets, that it actually does him some good to get away from it for a couple of months when he goes back home. And then when it's time to get back at it, I bet he's as hungry as ever.